Hey general contractors, renovation experts, and construction professionals. Protecting your business should be a top priority. Your clients require you to have liability insurance as a condition of the contracts you sign. By having construction liability insurance, you not only fulfill those requirements, but also demonstrate professionalism, reliability, and a commitment to your client's protection. It's a win-win situation for your business. Construction liability insurance is vital to protect you from the risks and liabilities that come with your line of work. It provides essential coverage for property damage, coverage for third-party damage or bodily injury, and other incidents that may occur during construction or renovation projects. Visit zensurance.com/save35 for a free construction liability insurance quote and get the comprehensive protection you need. Hello and welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey. On today's episode, we take a look at the current state of labor, both in terms of a shrinking labor force and increasing labor actions across the U.S. and Canada, with ConstructConnect chief economist Alex Carrick and senior economist Michael Guckes. But first, here's the latest headlines in the Daily Commercial News and the Journal of Commerce. Starting in the East, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau introduced a major shakeup in his cabinet on Wednesday, as several ministers moved positions and some others were shuffled out of cabinet in what is widely regarded as a move to strengthen the government's position before a possible election. We also have a story about DNA Road Services, a Concord, Ontario-based asphalt and concrete grinding and milling contractor, which was recently fined $125,000 after a pedestrian was fatally struck by a dump truck in a work zone near a TTC bus stop. There was also a dramatic crane crash on Manhattan's west side recently, where a fire on the crane caused the arm to collapse and hit a building as it fell to the ground. And a New Yorkville condo project designed by Diamond Schmidt has a flat iron design and a unique thin shape, allowing it to be built adjacent to natural heritage areas. Moving to the west, a strike has been averted at LNG Canada's under construction facility at Kitimat, BC. Employees at a lodge housing workers building the facility have won wage increases of up to 40%. In Langley, BC, a welding truck explosion felt like an earthquake, according to a witness, and photos and video at the blast site show a lump of smoldering metal with only the truck's grill recognizable, while the side of a neighboring SUV is caved in and debris is strewn across the parking lot. Finally, PCI Developments has submitted a rezoning proposal to the city of Fort Moody to build 2 residential towers in the city's Moody Center neighborhood. The buildings are a part of the parcel that makes up the Moody Center Transit-Oriented Development Master Plan and will be located adjacent to the area's SkyTrain station. And of course, we'll have links to every one of these stories in the show notes. That's it for the news. Now here's a look at labor and the broader economy with Alex Carrick and Michael Guckes. It's in time for another economic update. At this time, we're talking about labor with
Alex Carrick, chief economist, ConstructConnect.
And Michael Guckes, senior economist at ConstructConnect.
And the reason I brought them in is because these are economists. They know about labor. And like, as usual, I know less about the topic than they do. But we've had a lot of labor unrest, incidents. There's a lot of striking going on. The most well-known one is probably down in Hollywood. But then there's the Port of Vancouver that we had in Canada. We had federal workers striking. I believe we came real close to a real strike in the States, which would have caused all sorts of havoc. And so what I want to know is, economically speaking, is there a reason this is all happening now, and what led up to this?
Well, yeah, this is about as predictable as could be, frankly. I mean, the economy's been doing pretty well. There are some things that are not so good in the economy, but basically the unemployment rates in both Canada and the United States are extremely low. And there's been some generalized shifts in the marketplace, and in particular things like deglobalization and efforts to bring jobs back from overseas to the United States and to Canada as well. And I love things that are unintended consequences, because I've been saying this for a while, that with the bringing jobs back, you got to understand that that gives leverage back to labor, because for more than a decade, outsourcing of work to other countries, other low labor cost countries, meant that anybody who was working here knew that they couldn't squawk about their job or complain or whine, or any of those terms that relate to how we all feel. how we all feel about our jobs,
Mm-hmm.
is you could be replaced. But now it's not like that. And in particular, with the pandemic and supply shortages, you start to have bottlenecks in the economy, and bringing jobs back to the United States and Canada, you're handing over leverage to labor. And I was saying that there's going to be strikes, and there are strikes. I mean, it's pilots, it's nurses, it's the civil service, and it's but it's dock workers. I mean, that's one of the really obvious ones, and it happened in the States before it happened in Canada. And the economic effects all relate to inflation, and everybody knows that inflation has been a problem, although it's been coming down. But it's going to contribute to inflationary pressures for some time. But there's economic consequences from this. But I'm going to stop at that point. So Michael, I think turn it over to Michael.
It's really interesting when we look at inflation rates, they are coming down. We've seen that in the recent months of data. The one thing that hasn't really changed nearly as much are the wage increases that we're seeing, which are still around 5%. So if you look at the latest broad measures of inflation, we're around 3%, but wages in general are growing around 5%. So there's a real real increase, that is an inflation adjusted increase in wages that we're seeing. And of course, being such a structural component of the cost of doing business, it really does mean that the business owners and market analysts, need to be worried about these wages that are increasing very strongly. If you look at some of since we're talking about transportation, and Warren started off talking about the docks and whatnot. If you look at what's happening among the airline pilots, right? There was a new airline pilot contract where I think they're getting 40% pay increases. If I recall right, here is pay raises as much as 40% over, I think, a 4 or 5 year period. That is huge. And what happens is that when one union, right, gets a really great contract like that, the competing unions or the similar unions say, hey, we want some of that too. We don't want to settle for less than what the guy next to us is getting, right? And this is what some of those concerns that we economists have about wage expectations and the dangers of allowing wage expectations in a high inflation environment to create structural inflation. Because once we have a 5-year wage agreement that is going to raise everyone's wages by 5 to 10% or whatever it should be, that becomes fixed over the next 5 years, and that just adds to the cost of doing business, which means that the companies that are hiring those people, they need to increase their prices in order to cover those things. And so this is where that entrenched inflation becomes really dangerous, and why watching wages is so important for Alec and myself.
How much of this is down to demographics? Because we've talked before about how, we got a labor crunch because we just don't have enough people are retiring, all the rest of it. Does that sort of lend labor a little more leverage as well? It's like, well, we've only got X number of people and you need us, so you need to pay us more, sort of thing.
Yeah, well, this is a great topic. I'm glad you brought this up, because part of the problem with the labor supply is retirements. A lot of people have been retiring, and particularly in construction, a lot of skilled workers have been retiring. And if you know about because everybody's talked about baby boomers for decades. Baby boomers have been such an important part of society and the economy. The youngest baby boomer is now 58 years old, because baby boomers were born in between the mid 40s and the mid 60s. So the youngest is 58. And I go back to this theme about unintended consequences, because this is kind of funny. If you want to keep those older workers, you've got to give them incentives and so on. But one of the things that would keep older workers working is their worry about inflation. So it's kind of funny that beating inflation may contribute to the labor shortage, because if you're an older person and you've got on retirement and you suddenly realize that, my goodness, inflation's 8% or 9% per year, you're going to keep working. And you beat inflation, you bring inflation down to 2%. Maybe you won't feel the need to keep working the same way. So that's really interesting. Now, the other thing is, or one other thing is, that you're supposed to be able to have labor increases that are commensurate with productivity increases.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what you get taught in economics classes. And the productivity advances really aren't keeping up with the kind of wage increases that you're getting right now. So one of the implications of that is that there's going to be more and more automation, because that's what managers are going to do. They're going to see their costs for labor rise. And labor has more leverage, yes, but how does management respond to that? Well, they will try to bring in more robotics and more automation, generally speaking. Specifically in terms of construction activity, there's other ways of tackling the shortage. But for construction, one of the problems is going to be there's a huge proliferation in mega projects, which are going to tie up workers in some specific areas. And in the United States, that's already happened. There's been all these mega projects that have started. I mean, a huge number of them. And in fact, in ConstructConnect's latest top 10 list of projects, this has never happened before. 9 of the 10 projects were valued at $1 billion or more each. And labor is going to want to work on those projects because they're longer lasting, that they can sign contracts longer, and they're better paying, and so on. And Canada, we haven't had the mega projects so far. The Volkswagen plant is coming up. The Stellantis plant in Windsor was one, and there have been a couple of others. But I was looking at the list of upcoming projects in Canada, and you get a year or two down the road, and there's just a freakish number of resource projects, because this whole thing about transitioning, the energy transition to electric, and that means electric cars and so on. There's all kinds of new kinds of jobs too that people can work in. So we can get into that further along if you like, because I'm really interested in the new kinds of work that you can do rather than working in construction, which is going to be a problem for the industry.
So just to respond or to elaborate really on what Alec just said, he's absolutely right. His discussion, his points about automation, I get it. I think in the near term, right, especially when we think about construction and what it means near term for construction firms and for architects, really, because this is what I keep telling the architects is, the labor exposure on your projects is really your greatest risk. Either you don't have enough of it, you don't have the right type, they're not skilled properly. All of those things are real problems today. So how do we as architects or as construction firms think about reducing that risk? Well, what about through the greater use of pre-assembled parts? What about the greater use of modular construction? Make the work that has to happen on site easier and less onerous. That way, those workers that you can get out to these sites, are less likely to have an issue with construction. There's less of a chance for rework, other mistakes. Your productivity on site would hopefully be higher that way. And so, we've been talking a bit about that amongst our clients this year. The other thing too that Alec mentioned that I want to elaborate on is the mega projects and their how they create spikes in demand for labor in localized areas, right? Very important point. One of the things that I've been hearing a little bit about from some of our clients is on the small firm versus large firm scale, right? When a mega project comes into an area, those projects are largely being run by a very large GC, of course, who is going to end up using larger trade firms, and what's going to happen is that you may find out that a small firm with 4 or 5 employees that firm becomes at great risk of losing some of those employees because the large GC comes in, flashes good money at those employees, and all of a sudden that 5-person firm is now a 1-person firm. It's just left down to the owner. And I'm not saying that that is guaranteed to happen in every situation, but I think that's a very real risk. And it's one of those ripples in the industry that especially those small firms need to figure out how do they combat that, because that the larger GCs with human resources departments and best practices in that area, right? They're going to poach whoever they can get wherever they can. One of the interesting things that I saw in the data as I was preparing for today's discussion, I was looking at the level of construction workers by subcategory. So when we look at residential construction workers, commercial construction workers, and industrial construction workers, one of the really interesting things is that by and far, in absolute terms, there are more residential construction workers out in the industry than in any other subcategory. The smallest subcategory is the industrial sector. It's the number of people doing the industrial construction work is a tiny fraction of the portion of the labor force, or the portion of the construction labor force that's doing residential. The interesting thing here, right, is that if you look at starts, and I'm just speaking to the US for the moment, but I think the data is not all that dissimilar in Canada. Starts in the US have come way down with rising interest rates and just the economic environment that we're in. So given that we have so many people on the residential side, and the residential construction labor growth has been right around 3-4% in the last year, while starts are way down, it kind of begs the question, can some of those large GCs that are going after the mega projects, is there some way to convert some of that residential construction labor into industrial laborers? It's one of those fascinating thoughts that kind of comes across my mind as I look at the data. Maybe Alec has something to say about that, but again, I'm just trying to allow the data to tell me what it's saying, and do that without bias.
Well, it is kind of, I mean, that's certainly an interesting topic, is the interchangeability of labor between different kinds of work, like construction workers. Manufacturing has always been a pool, like construction and manufacturing often will draw workers from the same pool. And but then also you draw construction workers from resources too, like if somebody isn't working in some resource areas like forestry and so on, some of them will switch over to construction. So that's an interesting topic as well. Now, one final point, because we were talking about residential, and residential and immigration are hugely important for Canada, because the amount of immigration that's happening here, about 500,000 people a year are being allowed into the country. And so that gets into, well, who do you want those people to be? Well, you want them to be able to work in the trades. But the side aspect is that with all those new people, you need a lot of housing. And that, Michael was talking that in the US, the housing number is 1.4 million units right now. It came way down with the bigger hikes in the interest rates, and then it went back up to 1.6, but it was in the latest month, it was back down to 1.4. In Canada, housing starts have, for 20 years, been 200,000 units on average per month. Last year, they shot way up, and it looked like they were going to come down this year. But no, in June, they went back up to 281,000 units. And to accommodate all the immigration in Canada, there's going to have to be a lot of new home building. So residential construction is going to siphon off workers from other kinds of construction. So you got to have artificial intelligence and modular and all these other things.
Warren, let me just say one thing. So this is really interesting. This came out from the National Federation of Independent Businesses, the NFIB. I think it's their most recent report. It is from, June 29th. Really interesting. They classify the single most important problem for independent businesses as labor. And in their survey, and this is available off their website, so I'm not providing anybody anything that they can't find themselves. They asked their surveyed participants about their single most important problem. Fewer than 10% said that labor cost was their biggest problem. Almost a quarter of them, this was by and far, I think this was the largest category of any identified issue. A quarter of them said labor quality is their greatest problem. And I think that really speaks to this labor issue. And the reason I want to bring this up goes all the way back to what I said initially about willingness to pay for labor, right? And these wages, right? From the data, it suggests to me that firms will pay whatever it takes to get a qualified person in the door. If they can find that qualified person, it's not the wage that's the problem. The problem is just finding that person in the first place. And in fact, I think if you read deeper into their report, something like 92% of their respondents who have open positions and are looking for people, 92% of them said the greatest problem is the qualifications. They just almost nobody can find qualified workers anymore for whatever these unfilled job openings are. And I think that just really speaks to the supply and demand issue. Again, as Alex was saying, the baby boomers have left as a percent of the labor force. It has shifted downwards by around 1 to 2% since COVID, and that sounds like a small amount, but when 2% of the labor force left, and it was your most experienced laborers, and you're trying to backfill that with 16 to 24-year-olds, it just doesn't work. And the reason that I'm skipping the 25 to 54-year-olds right there is because already 84%, the labor force participation rate of that prime age working group, 25 to 54, 84% is already working. That is historically about as high as you can get. You can't get any more of them to work at that point than the 84% that's already in there. That really leaves that younger classification of workers, of laborers, to fill that gap, and they just can't do it. Either in quantity, they're just not out there. Or especially in skill set, they just don't have the experience. And so business owners who understand just how structural this problem is and how enduring the potential is for this to be, really need to start to own how they're going to train up these newer, younger, less experienced laborers. They have to own this problem. They cannot leave it to the tech schools. They cannot leave it to the young adults themselves to figure this out. It really has to come down to the construction firms need to own their in-house training. When I worked in manufacturing in the years before COVID, it was the same thing. The most successful manufacturers truly owned their in-house training and their people. They found people who were loyal because they realized how much the company was investing in them, and they not only did they train them up well, but then they gave them tons of opportunities to grow with that training. And of course they increased their pay in accordance as well. So give your employees, your new ones especially, when you find them, give them a way to grow, teach them how to grow, show them that there's a long-term track within the company that's going to help them to be really successful, because that's the new standard anymore.
I guess my final question is, if we keep hearing about a recession, it hasn't happened yet. It may not happen. You guys are more qualified than I am to say if it will or won't. But how will that affect labor? I can guess, but I'd like you guys to tell me how that'll affect the current labor. I would assume there'd be a lot less strikes if there's a lot less jobs, basically. My layman's analysis of it.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's traditional economic theory. I mean, really, and there's going to be a lot of arguing about whether this has been the right way to try and slow down the economy and get inflation back down, because it is counting on there being unemployment, which relieves pressure on wages and so on. But I don't know. The economy is still going okay, and there's people who are now thinking that maybe we won't have a recession, that there will be a soft landing, and we'll come out of it okay. But I don't have anything very exciting, I don't think, to say in terms of of where we're going with this. So we're going to find out. I do know that interest rates have gone up a lot, but it doesn't seem to be having a whole lot of impact on anything. There's an indicator that I really like, and it's the U.S. Initial jobless claims number that comes out every Thursday. And the reason I like it is because it's every week. And if the number of initial jobless claims goes up to 300,000, I mean, there's all kinds of things that indicate recession. But the initial jobless claims, every week it comes out, and you can be pretty assured that if the figure goes above 300,000, that you're going to have a slowdown in the economy. And it's still nowhere near there. It's the latest one. It got up as high as 260,000 a month or two ago. The number that came out today was 221,000, which is still very low. So that's good news.
Yeah.
That's good news.
Yeah. I think the other way to put what Alec is saying is that no two recessions are the same. And especially given that this one it has, the ripple effect of COVID behind it. We have 5% GDP, government spending, right? Government deficit spending is something like 5% of GDP in the US, which never happens outside of major wars and catastrophes. So, that's a huge tailwind, even though the Federal Reserve is doing the exact opposite, trying to slow down the economy, right? And then at the same time, too, the Federal Reserve is saying, well, we're trying to slow down the economy, but then they're committing behind the scenes. There's some incredible things that they're doing to backstop the banking system to keep that from collapsing because of what they've done with interest rates. And so, there's a lot of stuff that is going on, right, that makes today's economy look so different from any previous economy. And so to be able to ask any economist, well, are we going to have a recession or not? They just can't tell you because we've never seen this particular set of conditions before to know how it's going to play out in the future.
Okay, well, that's as good. Uncertainty is as good a place as any to stop. So thanks again, Michael and Alex, for joining us.
You're quite welcome.
Yes.
That's it for this episode of the Construction Record Podcast. If you'd like to hear more episodes, you can hear us on Amazon Music, Apple Music, and Spotify, and on daily commercial news and Journal of Commerce websites. Thanks for listening.